Um, Also, just as background information, this came out of a conversation that I had with Christine back in May when I came for the first time to Beirut. It was just a few days after the opening of the Venice Biennial. And that brought us to reflect upon a very basic sort of seems to be like a phenomenon a little bit, which is a sort of kind of Nietzschean return, eternal return of ideas that stem from the 19th century and basically define what is the golden age of the European left project, cultural project. And of course, I'm talking about people particularly like Bertolt Brecht and Walter Benjamin, two particular important intellectuals because they were heavily informed by Marxism and at the same time also by the modernist art movements. So there are some figures that I'm sure you have the same feeling that occur like sort of phoenix, like long-lived birds that are constantly being reborn. And some of them could be also quite old. One case is Karl Marx. And Karl Marx is this year actually one of the participating artists of the Venice Biennial, as you can see there. This is from the exhibition guide. It's my own copy. So, of course, there could be not only Marx, but there could be plenty of other important intellectual figures that artists and curators alike get inspired by, and artists and curators alike also refer to because of the importance that they have left in defining an intellectual landscape to which they associate themselves with. However, I kind of question a little bit the reason or the foundations, and especially when it deals, when all this kind of recuperation or revisitation or, let's say, retrospective revivalism deals with a certain way to analyze social realities and economic realities which belong to our era, to the 21st century. So my question is for today, and hopefully open to you, is whether this is a process of almost grave digging, taken from a grave, an exhausted body that continues to reappear and being put down to rest over and over again. In order to analyze this sort of tension of ideas, I take 2 or 3 specific persons. One is Vezor's work as a curator, particularly in relation to the current Venice Biennial, which accidentally happens to close today. The other one is Alexander Kluge, who is a German filmmaker and author. Germans would know him very well. He's very, very active in public TV. And he's released a kind of 9 hours long film, which is a sort of film opera, or quite an epic film in 2008 that was called News from Ideological Antiquity, Marx, Eisenstein, Capital, which has a small room inside the Venice Biennial. It's converted into a 3-channel video installation. It's quite discreet, however, for me, extremely important within the context of the biennial. And then there is, of course, the political economic thought of Karl Marx, which is extremely dominating a lot of readings within the exhibition, partly because Vezor decided to actually recite live Das Kapital throughout the duration of the exhibition. Das Kapital is actually consisting in 4 different volumes, so it's an extremely long book to read. But I'll go now into more details. So I don't know how many of you have seen the Venice Biennial. I just thought of giving you a little bit of impressions from the exhibition. As I said, Karl Marx is featured as one of the participating artists, and the exhibition is called All the World's Futures. And therefore has the reputation to be able, as a curator, to create extremely spectacular, visually spectacular exhibitions. One of them that is been quite impressive for a lot of people has been an exhibition that he did in 2002 called The Short Century, Independence and Liberation Movements in Africa, 1945 to 1994. It's needless to say that for a curator who has been the artistic director of Documenta and also of the Gwangju Biennial in Korea, to have also the possibility to be the artistic director of the Venice Biennial, which is the biennial in the art world, or also the eldest, is basically the apotheosis the one curator can achieve to basically make him one of the most important and powerful celebrities in the art world. But now back to the exhibition. All the world's futures. The title doesn't imagine, he says, some kind of utopian future. But it is more about how groups, which are minorities in the society we live, or different societies, because of course we belong to different societies, how these groups, can they find a stake in the ecologies that we inhabit together? One of the things that kind of validates this idea and is quite obvious throughout the exhibition is the presence of some 35 Afro-American and African artists. This is quite honorable choice from the side of a curator, because he's the first African curator to actually be in charge of this biennial, but also it wants to unleash the whole idea of what post-colonialism is. It's not just an elsewhere, but it's something that occurs at home in the first place. It's not something definable between East and West, but it's all definable through systems of power, oppression, authority. So these are some examples. Some of the artists that he chose to work with are actually older African-American artists, as in the case of Terry Atkins. Another artist, Caro Apokiere, is actually a graphic designer to start with, and this work is particularly meaningful for him because it deals with basically the reading of Africa from the side of Westerners, often referred to as a country rather than as a continent, made of multiple societies, multiple cultures, multiple histories. Another important work in the biennial was a sort of tribute to Harun Farocki, who is a German Iranian filmmaker who died not long ago. This is actually a sort of mini retrospective within the exhibition where 97 different films are running simultaneously. In the center you see some of his notebooks with his own notations about ideas and sketches for the films he made. Lily Renaud-Deval is a French artist. My Epidemic is based actually on a performative work around partly the work of Josephine Baker, the dancer, invented the danse sauvage. Her work is extremely dense with a lot of references. A lot of it has to do with colonialism and post-colonialist theory, but in these instances kind of more relating to the whole discussion around body and the perception of body mediatized within basically institutional spaces. What you don't see through after the curtains is actually a series of films where she is actually dancing naked in a kind of Josephine Baker style. And these are actually done in the on-site while the exhibition was being installed. So in a moment of private, basically, appropriation of space. Gottlook Ataman and Chris Mielke was actually in a room where two different body of works are sort of juxtaposed to create a sort of dynamic. Again, sort of just want to show you a little bit how he's installing works, historical work, in this case is Robert Smithson, which is juxtaposed with the work of a younger artist from Swedish-Argentinian called Runo Lagomarsino that you see actually hanging on the walls. I don't go in detail with the works, but I just want to give you some impressions. This is an Italian artist called Rosa Barba. And here we are to the marks part. Also, before I start with this, I just want to share with you some interesting statistics that I found about the exhibition. So apart from 35 African and African-American artists, 43% of the artists that were selected for the exhibition were from Western Europe, 21% from Northern America, only 9% from Asia, and the remaining from North Africa, Australia, South America, Middle East, and Eastern Europe. Then 62% were male artists, as of opposed to 37% female and 7 collectives. And 9 of all these artists were actually artists that created works that got sold this year for over $1 million US, top sellers of which being Bruce Nauman, Georg Baselitz, and Marlene Dumas. So within this kind of roster of artists, there is also Karl Marx, who is presenting his monumental 4-volume text, Das Kapital. It's quite interesting because Das Kapital, when he's being discussed within the context of this exhibition, is not referred to in its own translation, since everyone knows the book as Capital, but it's referred to as in its original language, German, Das Kapital. So, and this is basically sort of transformed into a series of time-based events, oral reading, songs, and performances in a specially dedicated agora space, a sort of kind of oratory in the center part of the central pavilion in the Giardini. The space was actually designed by a British architect, David Adje, and the actual live events were actually directed by a British artist called Isaac Julian. There was also a film program, again relating to this, that was curated by Mark Nash. Just a few images, and then I'll show you also a little intro to this.
We should then have 20 yards of linen equals 20 yards of linen.
I was interested in the nature of the voice as a carrier of meaning, the voice as a carrier of subjectivity, so to speak, a kind of a great pitch of orality in the body of the exhibition.
The most basic interests of the present ruling classes dictate to them that they clear out.
To go back to Das Kapital and to take, as it were, the actual text and to have that be a text that's recited out aloud to embody a certain liveliness in the performance is a re-signification or re-articulation of what capital might mean for today's audience.
Money of the world, end quote, in order to distinguish them from their merely local representatives.
The reading of Das Kapital within the context of the exhibition is not a declaration of my own Marxist position. So one has to begin with the fact that Das Kapital is a book of extraordinary analysis, a book that has, sufficient power and sufficient presence in our lives to occasion reflection, but maybe also to occasion some controversy.
Today I sang songs from Factory Songs, which were The Berry New Loom, The Pieces Tale, The Testimony of Patience Kershaw. That is written from the perspective of a 13-year-old girl working in the mines. She talks about how she's got a baldy patch on her head from where she pushes the coal buckets, so her hair wears away, and then she's got big muscles on her legs because she's pushing these heavy buckets of coal. A child shouldn't be in that environment. She works with naked, sweating men because when they were in the mines, all the men would get naked and then they would beat her because she wouldn't work quick enough.
In trouble with visit, there are doctors with visit, their lozenges, boluses, puppies and pills, with ointment for drawing and backing for chewing, with whiskey and shots to your ready the gills.
So it's a very stark image that she presents, and I think it's something that really needs to be communicated.
With a sight, the capital cannot buy.
I find an original musical manuscript that has something to do with politics. I remove the lyrics from the manuscript and replace it with the words from a political document. What I do is I remove the original harmony and I replace it with a harmony that's produced by translating the political document into musical notation.
A plastic chair, a shirt and a jacket hanging from a hook. 11. The bare fourth floor with openings of the 6 windows, traces of war. 12. On one wall, a slogan that is covered, but a pro-Syrian graffiti can be made out.
So why Marx and why Das Kapital? To reinforce the German. So certainly Capital is an important book, we all know that, and obviously we have a sense that, and several things is still very important for us to consider this book at the center of how we can understand our social realities, the status of the political and economic world in the 21st century. It is obviously very important for a certain art intelligentsia as a political treaty. Just very basic information about the book. Marx began writing in 1867, but it was actually completed after his death in 1983, completed actually by his all long-lasting friend, Friedrich Engels. And as a book, which is divided in 4 different volumes, it explains the laws of capital, basically, the different social relations that it defines. In an interview for the Guardian newspaper in May, Envisor claims that his exhibition doesn't endorse Marxism. You could see that also from what he just said in the clip. But that he wanted to do something that speaks of the situation we're in. I'm quoting him. I thought of Das Kapital, a book that nobody has read and yet everyone hates or quotes from. So Endeavor's interest in Marx's book is centered in its economic and social analysis of labor. This is quite prominent throughout the exhibition. So where art is seen as labor, art is also seen as an investigation of work, where art is actually a viable vehicle to analyze the social conditions of how labor is changing, partly due to striking, growing mode of inequality and migration, for instance, low-income migrant workers. Above all, Endeavor thinks it's a radical proposition from, I'm quoting him, it's a radical proposition to recite life Das Kapital because, in his view, this is actually a more direct way to engage with the topic. And particularly also to engage with the kind of debates that have followed, basically what has affected Europe after 2008, which is a big financial crisis. So for him, the central proposition of Marx's book can help us understand what's happening to us. One of the examples that he kind of uses to validate his idea is actually the inclusion of the Gulf Labor Coalition that I'm sure a lot of you are very familiar with. He actually thinks that this is a classic examples of the active citizenship that has been taken on by artists, not necessarily something that is connected to their work per se, but more the kind of idea that it's essential as active citizen to bring up issues and basically make a claim about them. If also thinks that this is also very important because in some ways it generates a whole discussion regarding how important European and North American institutions at the moment are partnering up with basically governments that are fundamentally delving into what is called modern slavery without going in detail. So I'm quoting him. He says that he doesn't endorse what the Gulf Labor Coalition does, but he does respect these artists to get involved in it and finds them very serious and finds it also important to develop a solidarity of thoughts with them because of their work. So in this section that I just showed you, the Reading Capital section of the Venice Biennial, there was actually, for a second you saw him talking, there was Alexander Kluge. So Alexander Kluge is actually present, as I was saying, in a very small room in the central pavilion with a 3-channel video installation, which is a kind of shorter version of this kind of extremely long, 9 hours long epic film that he made. It's a tour de force or montage in every single way. There is some excerpts from films, historical archival material, graphics, diagrams taken from all sorts of sources. I'm going to show you some of it because I think it's, for me, relevant in this context, but also because I hope that you're going to get to know his work a little more. I'm personally a big fan of his work. In 2008, Kluge actually made this kind of epic film called News from Ideological Antiquity, Marx, Eisenstein, and Capital. And it's a quite interesting premise. In 1927, Eisenstein happened to get acquainted with Joyce, and he basically had this long conversation and thought, how would it be possible to give formal representation to capital? Is there a style, is there an aesthetics that it can be associated with? This, I think, is a quite basic, fundamental question that could be easily translated a little bit in the, let's say, strategy that Envisor uses for his exhibition. Of course, I'm just purely speculating, but nevertheless, I think it's open to discussion. So, it's a kind of giveaway a little bit from the exhibition guide. Mark Nash, who is the curator of the film, program inside this kind of arena says, I'm quoting, in the 1920s, Sergei Eisenstein decided to shoot a film on capital so that the, quote from Eisenstein, the humble worker or farmer would be able to understand. So Eisenstein's film was never realized due to the fact that it was just almost impossible to give a form to capital. But this is kind of explained later on in the film. However, many other filmmakers and artists have tried to represent the dynamics of capital, end of quote. So suddenly, one of these filmmakers that tried to represent it again in 2008 is Alexander Kluge. Just to give you a little bit of information about him, in the 1960s, Kluge was actually a lawyer, actively working for the Frankfurt Institute of Social Research. He was actually an assistant of Theodor Adorno. That says a little bit also about his, basically, also radical engagement with left-wing thought. In 1962, he was actually one of the forerunners of New German cinema, and he was actually a co-signer of the so-called Oberhausen Manifesto, which was very important. He launched a whole new generation of filmmakers in Germany. And in 1988, he was invited by the German government to advise about the possibility of splitting the media sphere. At that time, it was the only public, to split it with the private channels, TV channels. And in that specific moment, partly because he was a lawyer, partly because he believed in an agenda where it's possible to seize mechanisms of basically cultural production by just creating parallel alternative worlds of cultural production. He basically managed to secure a slot in German TV, basically, in a specific TV station. I don't remember the name now. And basically, he's constantly producing films and showing them on TV, and it probably will happen until he dies. So every German would know them very well. He, together also with a sociologist called Oskar Necht, he also published in the 1980s a very important book called Public Sphere and Experience Towards an Analysis of the Bourgeois and Proletarian Public Sphere. This was published also in English in 1993 by the University of Minnesota Press. So, I'm going to show you a little bit of Kluge. Just the beginning of his film, although it's a little different from the one you would see. It's just specially made for the biennial. We're just going to watch 10 minutes of this.
12.10.1927. Der Entschluss steht fest, das Kapital nach dem Szenarium von Karl Marx zu verfilmen. Dies ist der einzig mögliche formale Ausweg. 4.11.1927 abends. In Amerika sind sogar die Friedhöfe privat. 100%ige Konkurrenz, Bestechung der Ärzte und so weiter. Die Sterbenden erhalten Prospekte, nur bei uns werden sie ewige Ruhe im Schatten der Bäume und beim Plätschern der Bächlein finden. Fürs Kapital. 2.1.28. Fürs Kapital. Die Börse darf nicht durch eine Börse wiedergegeben werden, wie in Mabuse, sondern durch Tausende von kleinen Details. Die Concierge als Anleihehalterin. Druck solcher Concierges in Fragen der Schuldenanerkennung durch Sowjetrussland.
4.4.1928. Analyse eines Seidenstrumpfzentimeters. 7.4.1928. 0:45 Uhr. Ein zerrissener Frauenstrumpf und der Seidenstrumpf einer Zeitungsannonce. Letzterer beginnt zu strampeln und vermehrt sich zu 50 Beinpaaren. Revue, Seide, Kunst, Kampf um 1 Zentimeter Seidenstrumpf. Der antike Film drehte eine Handlung aus mehreren Gesichtspunkten. Der neue Film montiert einen Gesichtspunkt aus mehreren Handlungen.
Nine hours, so we're not going to watch the entire thing, but it's just to give you a sense of how capital is depicted. So it starts talking about labor in different contexts. So from homework, you see the wife cooking the soup for the husband who's coming back from work, to now it starts analyzing, for instance, how a pair of stockings is made. It's made out of silk. The silk is basically fabricated in a place, but it's actually produced out of Indian, I don't know if it was already said, but it's actually made in India out of basically fermenting or like letting the animals produce the, I don't remember what they're called, the ones that produce silk, but basically they live in kind of Indian women's armpits. So we're going back into a sort of very extremely materialist sort of approach to understanding capital. This is also what Marx did, of course, in his book. And this is also how basically Kluge decided to represent it. To your knowledge, this is available online if you want to see everything. So, just to understand a little bit how Kluge also intends his understanding of capital. He calls it actually news from the antiquity. So this is quite important because he says, I'm not trying to revive something that is no longer there. Or there is nothing also particularly nostalgic about the idea of an unrealized project like that of revolution, for instance. But the context of which he calls ideological antiquity is something that actually is being discussed by a Marxist scholar that some of you may know, Frederick Jameson. And I'm quoting him because he kind of tries to unpick this whole idea of ideological antiquity. The concept of antiquity may have the function of placing us in some new relation with the Marxian tradition as well as that of Eisenstein. Marx is neither actual nor outmoded. He's classical. And the whole Marxist and communist tradition is precisely that golden age of the European left, to be returned to again and again with the most bewildering and fanatical, productive and contradictory results. It also adds, it would be an abomination, of course, to glamorize an era that included Stalinist executions and the misery of slave societies. The category, though, of classical antiquity may be a productive framework in which one can reinvent and energize the past. He also talks, for instance, Jameson, about the fact that through Soviet Russia or the Soviet Union, it was actually thanks to them in some ways that it was the end of Nazism. And also it was the kind of deeds for what would grow to be People's Republic of China. So basically this is how basically history sort of goes in this sort of permutations, and this is why Marx in some ways is, or this particular text by Marx is kind of quite interesting and productive to reassess how basically history functions. So my kind of question now is whether there is a sort of revivalist approach, maybe, or maybe scavenging in the grave, if one could say also, but definitely a revivalist or approach to history and narrations that bring together both Kluge and also Enweser's practices, and also an interesting staging to some extent. So in a recent interview, in a recent review for Art Forum of the exhibition, the old left-wing scholar Benjamin Buchlo has praised the exhibition for its, I'm quoting him, alienating aesthetic and critical counter-models. Because in his view, it is able as an exhibition to ignore basically the sort of demands of the art market. It ignores the demands of what and how, why we should look at what something that is just contemporary. In fact, one of the retrospective approach that Endeavour has taken for the exhibition is also the vast presence of artists that are no longer alive, or works that are basically were produced 40 or 30 years ago. One of them is actually this work by Marcel Broda. So there's actually a work that refers to Decor. It's called Jardin d'Hiver. It was produced in 1974. And it's actually on the back stage. It's like almost a backstage, or at least this is how I perceive it. It's almost like a backstage to this arena, this kind of red, voluptuous room in which the capital is red. According to Buchlo, this is a quite deliberate strategy. He sees the inclusion of people like Marcel Broders, but also artists like Hans Hacke, Alexander Kluge, Walker Evans, surprisingly old man in this instance, apart from a few exceptions like Isa Gensken, because he considered that their work was geared towards in his, again, quoting him, the dismantling of the bourgeois and post-bourgeois public sphere. As you can see, just by quoting him, you can already see the language coming through the Frankfurt School line of thought. As well as actually Kluge's book that I mentioned, the one in cooperation with Oskar Knecht. He also praises Julien's work for, again quoting, commemorating and resuscitating Marx. And he actually contrasts the way that has been dealt with in Venice to the way that, for instance, a big museum like MoMA does, with the whole series of performances that, according to him, are sort of enforced cult of narcissisms. So this, he praises basically these decisions as very audacious, and he actually finds the whole idea of a live reading of a book so important to him as something that has never really been done before, and he sees that the act of reading philosophy, it's actually a quite interesting way to permutate it into a performative act. It's quite a striking way to kind of bypass or like impart knowledge to the listener. So my question is, so dear Kluge, Buchloh, Jameson, but who is reading Das Kapital today? I don't even want to ask here how many of you have read it. Maybe some have. Is there anyone here who's read it? The whole thing? As a podcast. Okay. So there were 2-3 hands there. Curious to hear your thoughts. So, but I actually ran a check on some open reading lists from many business schools and economy universities that I could find online. And what is really striking is none of them had this book on their reading list for students. And this is quite struggling, particularly because I assume that this is kind of like the Holy Bible for the art intelligentsia of the Western art world. So I'm kind of a little bit puzzled why that happens. It's a quite striking realization. If Marx sort of defines our social reality, our idea of how capital defines our life, then how come that those who actually affected in the first place, that create capital, are not interested in reading and are not even interested in how much the idea of the past can compromise the way that they think of enacting their own means of work. Also, I kind of question if the reason why Das Kapital is present in a context like that of an art exhibition is whether it's trying to influence us to take more of an active citizenship, maybe. Or is it just simply preaching to the converted, maybe. So ultimately, my last question is, what does Marx capital does it reflect really ultimately the way that we understand our own capital or capitalism today, global capitalism? So I kind of thought of analyzing 2 aspects that for me are quite strikingly different from the way that he was depicting it 150 years ago. There are some questions, of course, that he could have never possibly have imagined. And one of them is basically what is the steam engine of today is certainly finance, global finance. So unlike banks that sell money and that even though they are intangible, but still, of course, exist physically in some ways, financial firms that sell things that don't exist. They actually basically invent debt. They permute from one country to the other. They're untraceable. They are networked. They don't operate like a bank or a multinational that kind of goes through vertical implementation of different companies. They also, in order to exist, have to all the time invent new tools, and they must be extremely creative. They have also to bridge over to other sectors in order to sustain themselves. And above all, they have to invent debt credits. So no one knows basically how we can measure this. And probably Marx didn't foresee this to happen. So this is a kind of consequence of basically the deregulation of governments and a little bit also a kind of contributing factors being the weakness from left-wing leaders in the West, at least, to basically try to put a break to this kind of systems. Stock market and credits have been basically winning over the way the state and also workers live or regulate. They have shaped the global economy by creating policies like exchange rate stability, which allows these financial firms to operate, the preference for low inflation, the restructuring of manufacture, the explosion of high-tech and digitalization, and also at the same time a profound weakening of union organizations. So an example of this is also that I want to say what has happened in 2008, which is also very striking, is the fact that when the crisis occurred, in a lot of different countries, the state decided to help banks and help financial companies by simply buy them out or kind of buying their stakes. And this is effectively a product of what would be called nationalization. which is generally predilected by the left, as we all know. So state intervention comes at the same time as finance. So state has to adapt to the way the finance works so that they can always come as a savior. And this is something that has been going on since 1989. In the 90s, there have been a lot of crises, and some of you may not remember them, but they have been smaller than the ones that occurred in the last 10 years, but still quite striking because governments basically had to implement new forms of cooperation with finance in order to provide a sort of buffer zone for them to exist, but also to prevent that they would be contagiously going over other areas. So in some ways, it could be said that the fusion between state and finance is the making of global capitalism, which means that the neoliberal project, basically what we understand as neoliberal is basically global capitalist today, but also it was basically already the premises already discussed by Marx. It's basically becoming almost like a revolution against us, a revolution against those who become more and more precarious, become more and more accustomed again as unequal with their unequal status. They become also accustomed with pollution, cancer as a consequence of that, or exclusion. So the market logic in some ways is paralyzing the world, and this is a quite concrete fact. Another fundamental aspect that is connected to 21st century capital is certainly a more maybe psychological and a moral aspect, which is connected to us as humans. And this is actually discussed by the Canadian journalist, left-wing journalist, Naomi Klein in her latest book, This Changes Everything. I don't know if some of you have read it, but one of her main sort of thesis or arguments is that neoliberal capital is winning over basically the old left project, partly because of the way that we have changed as humans. So we are basically very self-centered. We become basically inhabiting hierarchical individualistic thoughts. And we predilect the urge for economic growth. We also predilect a lifestyle and a consumption that is, it would have been imagined more only 30 years ago. So in order to change this way of this value system that we become acquainted with, it would be a radical, extremely radical change for us. And I can say this actually as an Italian, that this is something that my government in 20 years of Prime Minister Berlusconi has absolutely, I can totally validate this thesis, because corruption and money grabbing has become basically actually enforced by the government and the people that work there. So back to the exhibition. So, men at work. Let's talk about labor. So, if Marx was interested in how factory workers work, and Zever is definitely interested in skilled craftsmanship, it seems, at least to me. So, there is an interesting quote by Simone Weil that I think is a very interesting philosopher, who actually happened to work in a car factory during her life and also work as a unionist, who said Karl Marx never worked in a car factory. And this is quite interesting because he actually, as it's common knowledge, he actually never had a day job. He never worked in all his entire life. He was actually sponsored in order to write by his old friend Engels, who actually worked and he had a company. So Marx, he was so fascinated by the logics of capital that also somehow in his book didn't really analyze very well how the workforce operates. And this is quite striking because he bases the whole assumption of how capital works on the basis of social relations, which are enforced by basically the people who work. So, strictly speaking, according to Marx, we are born for the first time when we received our first paycheck. At the Venice Biennial, what is striking is that there are a few works, or quite so many works, that would deal with labor in a kind of quite direct way. And in my view, this is perhaps a little provocative, but in my view, I find that there is also a clear gender-specific coding connected to it. So there are men manufacturing church bells in a work by Hiwa Kei, men firing bricks, as in this instance of Rikita Vanesia. This is a work where there are 14,000 unfired bricks. They are neatly stacked, like as if you're building a house. And you can actually purchase one of them, and for 10 euros, take home one of these bricks, and the earnings from your donation goes towards NGO based in China, and it goes actually directly redistributed among the workers that actually made these bricks. Then there is a work by John Akomfra, Vertigo Sea, which depicts, for instance, fishermen and explorers. Happens to be all men as well. So another striking aspect of the biennial is also the presence of a lot of crafty artisanal work, which is also represented by traditional figurative drawing, which is in some ways a little bit in dissonance with the way that we understand contemporary art, which is so much based on de-skilling these days. So an example of this is, for instance, Mika Rothenberg. This is a little bit actually for me on the edge, because it's actually depicting labor in a quite surreal way. So it's not so documentary like the other male counterparts. And again, in a certain way, there is also, when it's diverse, labor is kind of female represented, and it's again through the historical lens with 19th century archival photos of female factory workers, as in the case of Jeremy Della, or for instance, Swedish feminist unions. There is also in the Arsenal a work by Petra Bauer, who is a Swedish artist. So for me, this is quite striking, because in the moment that we analyze labor, one of the things, especially as an Italian, I've been reading a lot about post-Fordist thinkers, and who happen to be a lot of them Italians. And one of the things that is striking is labor is not something that is connected to making. It's also connected to thinking. It's also connected to unpaid work, as feminists obviously taught us in the 1960s and 70s. It's connected also to a certain kind of idea of non-productivity, to an idea that social critique is a job per se. If you write a book, that is not a job. There is an expenditure connected to that. What is also quite striking is the way that the exhibition doesn't really, the gender-specified coding is not quite analyzed in a way that allows for a certain interpretation how gender is not something defined from a binary code of male-female, but also open to other forms of identities which are more fluid. We know from Marx always said that work is an essential means of expression, is actually a way for us to express ourselves and our identities. So one of the ways that this exhibition somehow seems to do so is in a kind of very normative or heteronormative way. We know from basically LGBT groups, but also feminist groups, that the sexual division of labor is designed for and by social norms. And of course, if we reinforce them through a certain representation of labor that reinforces that, then we are still stuck in a little bit of an old formal thought. Also, another important aspect, that I forgot to mention, is also the idea of refusal, which is also something that is very, very important for the whole tradition of the Frankfurt School. The idea of negation or refusal, or not taking part into something or counter-producing it, which is something that is somehow coming across a little bit in the film of Kluge. And again, in my view, it's not necessarily represented in the exhibition, even though it's a form of labor per se. So that brings us to very last section, which is my question of whether the reanimation of Marx is it a fruitful thing for us? Does that bring us to something that in some ways can be defined as a zombie ideology? Or is this, maybe I should ask, who is the zombie? Is it Marx? Or is it something like a lacking left identity, which has nothing to do with Marx, fundamentally? So Marx, as a tradition, or Marxian, let's say, thought, as a tradition, is acknowledged to be fractious and also academically marginal. Maybe that's also why it doesn't appear to be in the kind of reading lists for people who actually study economy or business studies. However, within the kind of gaps that this book can have, and the fact that some people take it as a kind of theological treaty, so still going back to 150 years old text, it still presents quite a lot of consistency, and it's clever enough as a book to actually not pretend to bring forth an eternal truth. However, it is hard to interpret Marx, and it cannot be taken for granted also that he was right, because it must be always proven anew if it was a good point about how we exist and how we understand our social reality and economic reality. So in some ways, I could say that Marx could be considered like a sort of zombie, neither dead or alive. But from a different viewpoint, there have been a few things that have occurred in the last few months, which could point out to a kind of change of direction. Just to kind of mention very briefly, in the UK, a new Labour representative has become Jeremy Corbyn, who is actually an old leftist, socialist. There has been a revitalization of the Syriza party in Greece, and a multi-re-election of Alexis Tsipras. Pope Francis actually has employed Naomi Klein as one of his papal advisors. I don't know if you come across that. There has been also a very recent election also in Canada of a socialist like Justin Trudeau. So this seemed to kind of point out to a sort of new trend, potentially. But at the same time, it's also good to be wary of the fact that, as Tsipras also showed us, despite the agenda, there is not the real strength or confidence in what it is to achieve the aims. So from this perspective, maybe this is not Marx to be the zombie, but maybe it's staggering on of a certain kind of agenda that is not really taken off, or basically the inability for many leaders or politicians to actually find a sort of political relevance. At the same time, I would say also there is the inability from politicians also to kind of monitor or put boundaries on the growth and the growth, but also the kind of staggering and of finance as a kind of new mechanism defining our existence. At the same time, there is also the kind of absurdity of them praising this kind of book that came out last year, Thomas Piketty, that some of you maybe know, Capital in the 21st Century. Even The Economist hailed the book as, hailed Thomas Piketty as the new Marx. So there is basically perhaps the last sight of these politicians is the kind of the last goal of these politicians is the fight against inequality. But maybe they are not the only ones. I leave this to, of course, multiple interpretations. But of course, the alternative to the political and social inequality that is produced by capitalism is not a lessening of economic inequality. But what we need is, as I said before, is a different worldview. It's a different way of organizing ourselves. And Naomi Klein goes as far as saying that we should actually go back to consumption levels as in the 1970s, which is never going to happen. But nevertheless, she thinks that that would be the only way. And just to kind of close this presentation, of course, there are different ways that we can sort of change our ways. But certainly what we would need to disassemble is different kind of categories like who is the powerless and who is the powerful, geographies of privilege, for instance, there is a distinction between who are the wealthy professionals that kind of go abroad to work, who are not called migrants, unlike the low-wage workers who have to work abroad for getting an income. We should also, as citizens, try to stop multinational corporations from gaining rights. So not let our governments actually make treaties that enable them to basically speculate on our backs. And also, a very important last thing is the growth of basically intelligentsia by different governments that is basically spying on us. And of course, we all know about the NSA. But some of you maybe don't know that in the States, the government is actually funding the construction and of enormous gathered data in buildings, which will employ thousands of people and also give a lot of work and money to data companies employed by governments. Thank you. Are there some questions?
Thank you, and thank you very much for your presentation. So when you started talking about that the business schools, they don't, and the economists, they don't read Marx today, it made me thinking a bit. Because some of the early, or the fathers of neoliberalism, Friedrich Hayek and the whole group that he was part of that is called the Austrian economists, they, at least they read Weber, and they had a reading group where they went every Friday in Vienna to read and eat. And they read a lot of not only, how you can say, like economy within their own ideology, but also a lot of left-wing and so forth economy. And the same also happened in the 60s and 70s, at least the Chicago boys in Chile, they read a lot of, they studied the Das Kapital very closely in order to understand Allende and his whole economic politics. So they were also ready when the coup came in with a whole new economic policy that was also one of the first places to install neoliberal economy. So I'm just thinking that today economy is somewhere else. It's not in the same way focusing on the good in the way as is happening in Das Kapital, and that maybe all this investigation that is taking place now in the art world about what is economy and how does it work should actually have been taken place back at the same time as Friedrich Hayek and his friends were reading Das Kapital in the 20s and in the 60s and 70s, when then a lot of this neoliberal thought was again developed. But what happened was that a lot of these thinkers were not that visible until then maybe the 80s. So I'm just thinking there's a whole historical disjunction, and that we are terribly far behind, and that this is, I mean, we're running, but we can't catch up, and it's, yeah. So I just wanted to know your comment about this kind of being very much behind. I mean,
one of the things that I try to point out, it's also kind of, I think there is an age, there is a certain anachronism certainly, but there is also a difference in the people that are involved, at least in the, you know, Kluge is 83 years old. There is a generational difference, certainly, I think, between my generation and these other people's generation. That I think plays a role, a big role. I mean, I do question personally very much, and this is what I try to do through this, do question the reasons why this becomes like a center stage of an exhibition in 2015. Especially when it's actually permuted in something like this music, it's obviously not about the text, really, any longer. And I don't have an answer for it. I mean, of course, it's a question, and I think I'm very open to that permutation per se. I think, why not? It's just kind of question why that specific text and not another one. And if that is the text, then I see a lot of congruence with what Kluge did, which is sort of revisiting what Eisenstein did. So I feel like there is a closed loop somehow. And I do question the strategies behind this recuperation.
Thank you for your lecture, but for your lecture, and I have some sorts of, maybe I want to share, I want to ask about of what you said, because for me, I think the idea of the context is something important, because the context, if you are talking about the geography or history also, because it's maybe if the ideas of Marx, Walter Benjamin, all of these classical literature of Frankfurt and Marx and this could be in a way for Europe, for example, at this time, or the universal economy, the globalized economy, it's zombies, but for our Arab world context, it could be valid, it could be valid analysis for different conflicts happening here. Also, I have, because it's you were more focusing on the Das Kapital of Marx, but also Marx have a big literature. You may know that for his literature is early Marx and late Marx and the early Marx, all of the Joe's question and these ideas about identity and different ideas, which is also still, I think it's still valid in the way of it's not could explain or analyze what we are living, the complication of what we are living now, but it also give ideas of which is, and I believe that the ideas it's also goes with the context, because it has its own life through this history when Marx did it or started to make this idea, and it's also vital, not equations or constants, it's vital with the time, but all the ideas of the conflicts of classes and this in different ways, and it's not only economic, but it's in different, not to have the orthodox Marxist ideas, but it has vital ideas. For this, I think the idea of the context could be something important, reading to this, referring to these philosophers of the idea of this philosopher, and also even for the contemporary philosophers like Berardi or Deleuze, which is totally, it has its own industry for the curators and artists quoting them in the context or outside the context, quoting them all the time. That to be more contemporary, to be more to the point. I think something we need to rethink about it.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for your talk. I got the impression from what you've presented today. I saw very little reflection on the role of the Venice Biennale itself in circulation of global capital today. And I was wondering whether I just missed that, or whether some of these artists that are engaging with Marx did in fact reflect on their own position within global capitalism.
I took just a very specific reading. I just analyzed and diagnosed the exhibition just through actually Marx. So I have been extremely selected and in this specific analysis, selective, sorry, in this specific analysis. I had a feeling through what I came across is that actually, that let's say the curatorial scaffold for the exhibition didn't define the actual realization of the works, or let's say, I don't think that there were many works that were actually produced for the exhibition. In other words, I have a feeling that they existed prior to the exhibition and they were brought together by him specifically to create a sort of path throughout which to sort of somehow indirectly, obliquely sort of relate. There were different filters. I don't know if you've seen the exhibition, so Marx is only one of them, so not all the exhibition refers to Das Kapital for the curator. There were very, very different, there were 3 different filters. As I said before, for me it was just a matter of bringing this as a kind of question of whether we could perceive, potentially not from the nice reflection we just had before, but it's just if we could perceive the interest from basically the art world for fundamentally what are zombie or dead ideas, and if these are still valid, and why are they still attractive, why are they still seducing us? Of course, the whole mechanism around making even the most important biennial in the world around it, when it's supposed to be a trendsetter for a certain agenda, or bringing forth, perhaps Documenta has more that a core as a mission, to kind of bring forth a sort of agenda, or bring forth a sort of methodology that is existing now. The Venice Biennial perhaps does that more superficially because of the time frame also, and the kind of foundations of how it's the economy behind as an exhibition. One of the things that I found quite interesting, talking of money, which I just very briefly mentioned, is the fact that on the one hand you have an important leftist scholar like Buchlo that praises the exhibition as being fundamentally anti-commercial, and then having basically 9 artists that have sold their work for so much money this year. So there is a kind of contradiction at play there, which I think is, I was hoping that kind of reveals a little bit the difficulty to analyze actually this territory. It's not so strictly prescriptive. You can't just read it in one way. You have to analyze it from so many different aspects. How the art world basically supported this through economy, of course, through capital.
Can I ask why David Harvey, you didn't mention at all, but he also has been reading Marx for decades and provided access, and he was also part of the biennial.
Yeah. I basically decided to, of course, he's very present in Isaac Julian's work. I was more interested in actually talking about the actual central pavilion, the kind of the agora, partly because I was connecting it to a Kluge, of course, to the idea of staging, formally representing a book. I feel, though, that, of course, there is an interesting crossover between Isaac Julian's work and what he did for the biennial. David Harvey, I'm not an expert, I don't know so much about his work. I do know that he's a very important Marxist theorist and scholar. However, for what I understand about him, and because of his book that came out in 1982, the Limits to Capital, I think it's called, no? But I do understand that there is a certain orthodoxy connected to the way that he sees Marx, whereas a lot of these kind of economists and scholars that are specialized, they kind of take different sides, and they have different understandings of how to interpret Marx's book. He's certainly the one who knows the most, because he has done that for decades with his students, but at the same time, I understand that not necessarily everyone agrees with him. So, of course, it's interesting that Isaac Julian invited him to talk about it in this kind of staged sort of performance that became a film. But actually, in the review that Benjamin Buchler wrote, he said that one of the most striking moments of that film was when Stuart Hall basically contradicted David Harvey because he basically said you don't consider that. Obviously, there is a race agenda connected to labor, and you don't bring it up. But I thought it was kind of interesting also that it doesn't set the agenda, even though he's a very important scholar.
Thank you very much. I'm interested to understand more how you understand zombiness. Is it when the ideas are old, then they are kind of zombie, or what makes a certain system of ideas zombie? I'm asking this because, like Ali said, one can also notice a certain, what you may call production of zombie through the heavy usage of certain ideas, like for example Deleuze, no? Because it's like have been heavily quoted and used in the art context, that you cannot really listen anymore to Deleuze or like to his fundamental concepts like becoming and stuff like that, and he or his ideas became very flat and kind of zombie, you know.
Plato is also a holy Bible, right?
So I'm wondering like how you understand zombiness or the state of zombie.
There is actually an economist that's written a book called Zombie Ideology. But zombie fundamentally is neither dead or alive. It's in transition. And I thought this is a quite nice sort of definition for something like Marx, because it doesn't seem to be dying all the, if it's dead, it gets recuperated. And it goes in phases. And apparently also Capital as a book has also gone through phases as a book in terms of recuperating or reanalyzing it, rebringing it out throughout 150 years of its existence. It seems like there is an interest in this specific book in moments when the economy is kind of picking up. And it's not a surprise. When the economy is working well, then people start kind of going back to that book, because obviously it analyzes specifically the mechanisms or surplus value and all these kind of theories. On the other hand, in moments of non-strictly related high engine capital working, then it seems to be abandoned. So this is at least what I understood in my research, that it goes in phases. It's a book that kind of comes and disappears, comes and disappears. It's kind of interesting now. I wonder if this is on the high right now. The film that, now talking of the art, specifically to the culture sector, which we are talking about now, Kluge made this film in 2008, which is coinciding with the financial crisis. I don't know if it was, probably it was not done, it was a coincidence, my guess. But perhaps this is something that is already in the air. I don't know, I can't say. I'm just trying to draw lines between things that I notice and seem to occur around me. Okay, we call it a night. Thank you for staying.